All right, well, welcome everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the 8th Annual Delaware River Watershed Forum. Today's session is brought to you by DRBC and is on a fishable, swimmable, and drinkable Delaware River Estuary. Before we dive in, I just want to cover a few housekeeping logistics. This session is being recorded and will be posted to our website early next week. You have the pleasure of referencing it later on or sharing it with folks that couldn't be in attendance with us today. We are asking everyone to mute themselves if you're not speaking. If you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll do our best to answer, and there will be a Q&A towards the end of the session as well. My name is Kelly Knutson. I'm the State Policy Manager with the Coalition. If you do have any technical problems, just privately message me in the chat and I will do my best to remotely assist you with any of that. As a reminder, we're coming to the close of our forum this year. It's been an excellent event and I hope that you all have participated in various sessions throughout. If you do want to attend any of this afternoon sessions, the schedule can be found on sketch.com. We're asking folks to just provide your feedback there as well if you have gone to any of these sessions to help us improve future events like this. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Steve Tambini to talk. Take it away, Steve.
Kelly, thank you. Just let me know if you have any problems hearing me. Kelly, can you advance the slides, please? So while he's doing that, I would just say that we have a good crowd here, so thank you for joining. Hopefully that you had a good forum session, and I look forward to speaking to you about the fishable, swimmable, and drinkable Delaware River Estuary. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So for those who are joining us, I'm going to start with a poll question, and Kelly is going to help with that a little bit in a second, but let me introduce it. So what advice would you give somebody that you care a lot about, whether it's your spouse, your partner, friend, child, and it's a nice hot summer day in Philadelphia or in Camden, and they want to go swimming, and it rained the night before. So you've got a few choices here. You can tell them to go for it, enjoy your swim, maybe wait up to your knees or wait up to your belt line and be careful. You might tell them, hey, go swimming, but maybe keep your head above the water. Or you might tell them to stay out of the water. So those are your choices. Kelly, maybe, I'm not sure what they need to do to...
The poll should be live and they can select any option.
So before the poll ends, I think I'm going to ask Kelly to close it. And maybe we'll go over it at the end, if that's okay.
Totally. Give folks a couple more responses. About half of the participants have responded so far. All right, I'm going to end the poll.
Great. So if you go to the next slide, we'll revisit the poll question a little bit later in the presentation. And once again, thanks for joining us. Our objective today is to focus on the urban reaches of the Delaware River Estuary. I'm sure if you've joined the forum, you've probably been to different parts of the watershed. Today, we're going to focus on the urban reaches of the estuary. And the reason is this question of fishable, swimmable, and the potential threat to drinkable waters. Probably the greatest challenge is coming right in the urban estuary. So while the basin and the watershed is 13,000 square miles, the issues related to fishable and swimmable really are the greatest in the urban estuary in the Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington area. And I'll tell you this, that I've heard people talk about this subject already, and they've done a great job inspirationally talking about the goals of fishable, swimmable water. I know that sitting in the regulator chair, we're already being addressed with some legal issues related to this matter. I'm probably not going to be the most inspirational speaker today, and I've got some of my staff helping with this, and they'll probably talk longer than I will. But really what we're going to do is to talk about a practical review of the problems that are impacting water quality, because that's the real issue here. To attain the goal of fishable, swimmable, drinkable water, we have to potentially improve water quality. And we're also going to talk about some of the practical toolboxes of potential solutions. Hey, Kelly, I'm going to stop here a second. I keep getting admit people to the waiting room that's covering my slides. Is there any way to stop that? Sorry, folks, but it's covering up the bottom of my slides.
Now?
No, I'm good.
Perfect.
Okay, so we're going to dig a little bit deeper and a little bit wider into some of the potential solutions. And again, I won't touch too much on the legal issues. I won't we'll certainly touch on the goals of attaining fishable, swimmable waters, but we want to dig a little bit deeper. I will say this, we're probably not going to have all the answers today, but we'll certainly have a conversation in terms of what some of the solutions need to be discussed. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the Delaware River is a national success story. There's no question about that. And one of the primary reasons it's a national success story is the fact that we've made significant improvements in water quality in the urban estuary. We've certainly done a great job collectively as a basin community to protect water quality in the river as well. But as you can see, as recognized by American Rivers 2020, they not only recognize the national success we've had in the Delaware River, but they also recognize that there's more work to be done. And some of those issues in red there, we'll get into a little bit deeper, but those are some of the challenges that we've got to make sure that we can meet the next chapter of water quality improvements in terms of fishable, swimmable, aging infrastructure, urban development, climate change, saltwater intrusion, sewer overflows, etc. Next slide, please. So let's start with the goals. I mean, it is always a good place to start with the goals. And again, I don't want to get too much into the legal issues here, but we do need to, if we have a goal of attaining fishable, swimmable waters, we do need to understand what that means. And I'm going to go back to the Clean Water Act of 1972, and most people know that that's a good place to start. They've defined swimmable, fishable waters as not, from a fishable perspective, not simply being able to cast a rod into the river and catch any fish, but it really is for the protection and propagation or reproduction of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. And even for the most sensitive species like the Atlantic sturgeon that you see there on the right. In terms of recreation, what it says is to provide recreation in and on the water. Now the folks there on the left doing that paddleboard yoga, they're on the water. If that were me, I'd probably be in the water. But we're not just talking about recreational uses for boating or for paddleboarding. We're talking about swimming. We're talking about improving water quality for swimming. And again, we've made a lot of great strides in terms of improving water quality, but to achieve fishable, swimmable waters in the estuary is a unique challenge. In fact, it's such a unique challenge that the goal of the Clean Water Act in 1972 was to achieve fishable and swimmable waters as a nation by 1983. So you can see that from a practical standpoint, there's a lot of challenges related to that. Can you go to the next slide, please? Not only do we have goals at the federal level for water quality, but as you probably heard before, the DRBC also has goals. And you've probably also heard that DRBC regulations were actually in place before the Clean Water Act. Our first regulations, which are still in use today, were first promulgated and set water quality standards for the tidal part of the Delaware in 1967. And some of the uses to be protected, and the ones we'll talk about the most here, are the ones in red. Public water supply after reasonable treatment, meaning drinking water, except where natural salinity precludes its uses. In other words, the goal is necessarily to make sure that we have drinking water protected in the bay. Now, we do know that you can drink salt water for drinking water purposes, but used to be protected for the Delaware River Estuary is for freshwater. For fish and other aquatic life and for recreation, it also should be noted that there are goals for navigation. Again, it's an urban river. There's commercial navigation. There's uses to be protected for waste assimilation and other uses that may be provided by the comprehensive plan of the DRBC. So we've used the goals of the Delaware River Basin Commission and the Clean Water Act together to achieve these objectives. Kelly, can you go to the next slide? Before we attack any solutions, we really need to talk about the problems, and the ones in red are probably going to be highlighted more often in this discussion by John and Amy. But let me just touch on some of the major sources and major issues of water quality pollution in the urban estuary. I think you're familiar with most of them. When we talk about domestic and industrial discharges, wastewater treatment plants, yes, there are industrial discharges, but let's face it, it's an urban center. The population is very high. And John, a little bit later on, I think we'll talk about carbonaceous oxygen demand and nitrogenous oxygen demand. And a lot of times, I think we need to at least discuss really what's going on here, that we, as a population, create a lot of waste. And that's reflected in carbon and ammonia that has an impact on the water quality in the estuary. In fact, ammonia, we've done a pretty good job up till now to remove some of the carbonaceous issues, but we still have an issue with ammonia that John will get into a little bit later. And again, a lot of that is because of us. In terms of bacteria or pathogens, there are several sources because it's an urban area. You've got stormwater runoff, you've got extreme weather that creates sewer overflows, but you even got routine weather, rainfall events, and again, John will talk about this in a little more detail. And you've got a system of what's called combined sewers and combined sewer overflows, where when it rains, you've got raw sewage that potentially goes into the river, and that needs to be addressed as well, and that's unique to the urban estuary. We've got toxic and legacy pollutants like PCBs. Those are pollutants that are no longer being produced, but they're in the environment. The DRBC and along with the other discharges have been working to remove them from the environment, but certainly that's an issue that is a water quality issue in the estuary. In terms of drinking water, Amy's going to talk a bit about salinity. As I said before, right now we manage fresh water to our drinking water intakes, but we're seeing additional threats of salinity both from the upstream road salts and from the downstream direction or the ocean direction due to sea level rise. And that's going to present some challenges from a drinking water perspective. The more we look, the more we find, the more technology we have, the more we can find contaminants or new contaminants or contaminants of emerging concern. One that's gotten a lot of discussion lately are perfluorinated compounds. Again, from a drinking water perspective, we can treat perfluorinated compounds, but some of these compounds are toxic both to humans and to aquatic life and present water quality problems in the estuary. Because the estuary is urban, because it is commercial, we not only face land-based spills, but we face spills from a shipping perspective as well. So again, we're going to focus on some of the ones in red there as we go forward, because those are the ones that continue to challenge us from a fishable and swimmable perspective, and potentially will challenge us in the future from a threat perspective on drinking water resources. Next slide, Kelly. So again, I've heard a lot sitting in my chair and the regulator's chair about solutions, and certainly the Clean Water Act and the Delaware Basin Compact collectively had provided solutions in the past in terms of improving water quality, and it will continue to do so in the future. But as we attack this problem, I think, can you go to the next slide, Kelly? Next. We need to really think about more complex and integrated solutions. Yes, regulation will continue to be a tool in the toolbox, not only at the federal level with the Clean Water Act, at the interstate level with the commission and the commission states, but I think most of us recognize that the states actually implement the Clean Water Act through their permitting programs, and that we've got other layers of best management practices and policy and regulation, both at the local level, like the City of Philadelphia's got some exceptional water quality protections there locally, at the county level, and even through BMPs, but we got to think a little bit broader about solutions. Kelly, next slide, please. Oh, that one didn't come out too well, did it? What that says is data science and technology. We need to leverage data science and technology in many different ways. I think as we go forward, and John will talk about this a little bit more, I think we have an opportunity to dig deeper into the data and into the science and see if, okay, there might be areas if we look locally and monitor and assess locally where, for example, if we've said we really shouldn't be swimming in this area, maybe that area is a little bit too big, and maybe there's areas that are more local that we need to look at a little bit closer. We also have tools right now, City of Philadelphia CSO CAST tool and the River CAST tool are good for giving the public a heads up in terms of when combined sewers are overflowing, when the river might be, in the case of River CAST, when the Schuylkill River might be better for swimming. And I think those tools can continue to be developed and help to give the public a better advanced notice of when there are opportunities for things like public recreation. Right now, we do monitor the water quality in the river. We in USGS does a lot of the monitoring of water quality in the river on a real-time basis. But we are challenged at times for things like pathogens, but the technology is improving. And we're getting better technology where we'll have better information. So we continue to want to lean on science and data and technology. And lastly, and we'll talk about this as well, next please, we certainly need to lean on investment in infrastructure. Again, the objective is to improve water quality, not just to improve regulation. And the way we've done that in the past and the way that it works, continues to work, is make an investment in infrastructure, both green infrastructure. We have leaders in the nation and in the world right here in Philadelphia implementing green infrastructure, through gray infrastructure like advancing and improving our wastewater treatment plants, and other gray infrastructure for stormwater improvements. But the other piece to the equation as well is, as we think more about, for example, on the issue of swimmable recreational uses, we also have to think about public health infrastructure. Just like where we have recreational opportunities in beaches and recreational opportunities in other parts of the river, we also have a public health infrastructure that helps support that and make sure that people have a way of knowing when it's safe to swim and when it's not. One more slide, please. And then there's the question of who pays when we get to the solutions. Next slide. So the agenda is, I think I've set the stage a little bit, and hopefully John and Amy can get a little bit deeper into some of the issues. John Yagacek is our manager of water quality assessment, and he'll be talking about fishable and swimmable waters. Amy Shallcross is our manager of water resource operations, and she's going to be talking about some of the threats that we're dealing with in terms of making sure that we do have drinkable waters right now, there's no question about it, but as we deal with that salt issue, I think it's going to continue to challenge us going forward. I'll have some wrap-up comments. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat, and hopefully we will have plenty of time to get to your questions at the end. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Amy.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Steve mentioned, I'm going to talk about DRBC's efforts to get toward a fishable and swimmable Delaware River. And I'll start off with fishable. Next slide, please. So certainly one of the most important pollutants that we had to deal with to try to get toward fishable is polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. And PCBs are a probable human carcinogen. Most of our exposure to them is through contaminated fish, a little bit through water, but primarily contaminated fish. And the Delaware Estuary had PCB concentrations that were between 100 and 1,000 times higher than criteria. So pretty elevated levels of PCBs. And to address this problem, DRBC developed the total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs. That's the remedy, the pollution diet, to get to moving toward meeting criteria. And we did that in 2003 for the urbanized part of the estuary and 2006 for Delaware Bay. And under that TMDL, the point dischargers had to perform what's called a pollutant minimization plan. So they looked at their facilities, they looked at their process, they figured out where PCBs were coming from, and they got them out of the system. And initially, DRBC did a lot of the review of the PMPs. Today, our states are doing a lot of that review, so it's a real collaborative effort. And DRBC manages all of the data from the PMPs. And this was a decades-long commitment, and it will continue to be a decades-long commitment. But the bottom line is that between 2005 and 2016, the PCB load from point dischargers decreased by 76%. So that's a great success story. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of text on this slide. What I want you to focus on is what we really care about here is the fish and the fish tissue. And the quote here is from DNREC Secretary Sean Garvin, who indicated that, because of DRBC's efforts, the fish consumption advisories could be relaxed. Next slide, please. And to give a little bit more detail on that, New Jersey and Delaware, for all finfish and white perch and channel catfish, had a do not eat advisory before 2015. And in 2018, that changed to 3 meals per year. Pennsylvania, similarly for carp, prior to 2015, had a do not eat advisory. And by 2016, had an advisory for 6 meals per year. So clearly the control of the loadings is starting to be seen in fish. The trajectory is in the right direction, and so conditions are improving. Next slide, please. So a longer term story for improving aquatic life in the Delaware Estuary is the dissolved oxygen story. And dissolved oxygen, of course, is not a pollutant. Dissolved oxygen is a good thing, and we want plenty of it. But if you go back to the 1970s and prior, as shown in the graph here, DO in the estuary was typically less than 1 milligram per liter. And that's too low for fish to get past Philadelphia and Camden to go upstream to spawn. So DRBC in 1967, let me just move this so I can see my slide better. In 1967, adopted water quality standards, and in 1968, developed waste load allocations to improve the dissolved oxygen. And the wastewater treatment facilities implemented those waste load allocations by adding what's called secondary treatment to their processes. And that was done throughout the 1970s and 80s with funding under the Clean Water Act. So what was the pollutant? Well, the pollutant was primarily carbon, and that carbon came from primarily us. It was in the form of what we call carbonaceous biochemical oxygen demand, and the waste load allocations that were developed helped to substantially reduce that CBOD. Next slide, please. To give a sense of how the estuary responded to that, there are a couple of graphs here that are each a snapshot in time. And I'm looking at the top left-hand graph here. And just to orient you, on the right side of that graph, that is the Delaware at Trenton. So that's the top of the estuary on the right. The left-hand side of that graph is the mouth of the bay at the Atlantic Ocean. The red line is our dissolved oxygen water quality standard. And you'll see that that red line is different values in different places. So in the most urbanized part of the estuary, zone 3 and 4, that criteria currently is 3.5 milligrams per liter. And the points on the blue line are the observations at the time. And if you look the top left-hand graph in 1967, we were mostly not meeting criteria. We were mostly below criteria. By 1987, in the middle graph, we were doing a better job. We were meeting criteria frequently, but we still had some excursions below criteria. And by 2019, we're nearly always meeting criteria. So a big improvement in dissolved oxygen in the estuary. Next slide, please. But the effort's not over. And if you look at this plot, the blue line here is the current dissolved oxygen SAG, the current DO SAG. Again, the Delaware River at Trenton is on the right-hand side, the mouth of the bay at the Atlantic Ocean's on the left-hand side. And right in the middle of the estuary, in that most urbanized portion, we have a continuing DO SAG. Also plotted on this plot are the ammonia loads from our point discharges. And it's the percent of the total point load. And what you'll see is that our oldest, largest facilities still have a remaining high ammonia load, and that high ammonia load is co-located with the existing DO SAG. So back in the 1960s and 70s, we dealt with the carbon portion of oxygen depleting materials. What's left over today, and what we have to deal with today, is the nitrogen portion, particularly ammonia. So that's our conceptual model, is that it's the remaining ammonia that's contributing to the DO SAG. There probably is still some carbon impact as well, but probably mostly ammonia. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with that? Well, the commission passed a resolution, Resolution 2017-04, and it set out a series of steps for staff to follow that would ultimately lead the way to rulemaking, a new designated use, and a new dissolved oxygen criteria. And some of the steps that were called for in that resolution include studies on fish and DO, including dissolved oxygen requirements of aquatic species and spatial and temporal distributions of estuary species. It called for modeling studies, so it called for the development of what's called a eutrophication model, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then ultimately using that model to figure out what the loadings from point and non-point sources would need to be to protect aquatic species. And then finally, it called for some cost and feasibility studies, including capital and operating costs for improved treatment, and then also looking at social and economic factors that would affect attainability. And all of that will ultimately lead to an analysis of attainability, and from there, new designated use and new dissolved oxygen criteria. Next slide, please. So the eutrophication model that I mentioned, this is really the linkage between the loads that are coming into the estuary and how the estuary responds. So the loadings coming in would be nutrients from point sources and non-point sources, and then the model will tell us how dissolved oxygen will react to that. So we'll be able to use this model to say, okay, well, if we change the loadings in this way, what change in dissolved oxygen do we see? And so this work is still very much underway, but we're making good progress on this. Next slide. For the cost evaluation part, we contracted with a consulting firm called Kleinfelder, and we asked them to look at the top 12 ammonia loading facilities and to provide a cost estimate of what it would cost for those facilities to get to different effluent levels of ammonia and total nitrogen. So they looked at what it would take to get to 10 milligrams, 5 milligrams per liter, and 1.5 milligrams per liter of ammonia, and also what it would take to get to 3 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen. And total nitrogen is ammonia plus nitrate plus any other nitrogen species. And that work was initiated in 2018 under a 2-year contract. Next, please. And they're just about wrapping that up now. So we do have a draft technical memo as a result of that work. And we're coordinating that with our Water Quality Advisory Committee. We also shared it with the point dischargers that were part of that study. And so we're just about ready to release that. And what that report found is that if each of the top 12 ammonia loading facilities upgraded to achieve 1.5 milligrams per liter of ammonia, so not the most stringent, not the total nitrogen, but the 1.5 milligrams per liter of ammonia, the total present worth cost would be about $2.7 billion for that. Next, please. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some of our efforts toward a swimmable Delaware River. Next, please. And to do that, we have to start with our regs. So if you look at our regulations, we've got 2 different categories of recreation that are protected in our regs. So we've got recreation, and that includes all water contact sports. That includes things like swimming. And we've got a category called recreation secondary contact. And that would include things like boating and fishing and other activities where water ingestion is minimal. Next, please. And where do those apply? Well, if you look at the map on the right, that orange band, that area between Philadelphia and Camden, that is zone 3 and the upper part of zone 4, that's the secondary contact part of the estuary. Everywhere else, the entire rest of the estuary, all the blue, and all of the non-tidal river that's actually not shown on the map, that's above Trenton, all the rest of that is recreation. So only that portion in the orange band is the secondary contact portion. And if you look at our criteria, we've got criteria for fecal coliform and enterococcus. And in that secondary contact reach, those criteria are a bit higher. Next, please. We're not the only ones to have criteria. So EPA has nationally recommended criteria. Their criteria are a little bit different. They've got values for enterococci and E. coli. They don't have fecal coliform. And they've actually got 2 different levels of risk tolerance. So they've got criteria that are protective for 36 illnesses per 1,000 primary contact recreators, and a set of criteria for 32 illnesses per 1,000. In addition to that, they've got criteria that are based on a geometric mean. So you would go out and you would collect some samples, typically 5 samples in a 30-day period. You'd compute the geometric mean and you would compare it to that value. but they also have what's called a statistical threshold value, or STV. And the STV is more of a one-to-one comparison. So if you have an observation, you can compare that result to the STV value and see if you're above or below that. Next, please. So where's the bacteria coming from? Well, it's coming from a couple of different sources, including combined sewer overflows. For anybody who doesn't know, a combined sewer overflow is legacy inherited infrastructure. It's our oldest, largest communities have them, and it's where stormwater from rainfall is directed into the same pipes that carry the sewage from our homes and businesses. And when there is a large enough rainfall event, the capacity of those pipes can be overwhelmed, and some non-treated wastewater can be discharged into the estuary. It's important to recognize that, again, this is old infrastructure. Anybody who is alive today was not alive when these things were designed and put in place. And I think it's also important to remember that, you know, these systems solved some pretty dire public health consequences of the day. They leave us with new problems today, but at the time that they were put in, they were trying to solve a problem. Some other sources of bacteria include urban runoff, including municipal separate storm sewer systems, or MS4s, and even includes urban animal life. So in our area, particularly things like Canada geese and dogs are also probably a contributor. But it's important to recognize that the sources are local. So we're not talking about bacteria that originates up in the Catskills and kind of makes its way all the way down. What's coming into the estuary is coming in kind of right next to the estuary. Next slide, please. So what has DRBC been doing? We've been doing a lot of monitoring in 2019 and 2020. We've been monitoring typically 5 times per month during the recreational season. In 2019, that was May through September. In 2020, we were delayed a bit due to COVID, but we did initiate that in July. And we've been monitoring 5 sites in New Jersey and 4 sites in Pennsylvania, and those are shown there. And monitoring for fecal coliform, Enterococcus, and E. coli. Next, please. So what's it look like? Well, this is one snapshot of a much more involved comparison that's posted on our Water Quality Advisory Committee website. If you want to see the more involved version, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send you the link for that. What this is showing, this is a comparison of E. coli to criteria. And we've got the sites across the top and the dates sampled across the left-hand side. And on this heat map, green is good and orange is bad. So the greener the cell, the more below the criteria for that date and location. The oranger the cell, the more above criteria for that date and location. And what we see is it's a pretty mixed bag. We have some sites that don't look too bad. We have some sites that look pretty bad. And we have some sites that sometimes look okay and other times look not okay. Next, please. And overall, when we do the assessment by geometric mean system-wide, that looks fairly unfavorable. So that comparison didn't look very good. When we do the assessment by geometric mean on a site-by-site basis, that comparison looks better. It looks mixed. So there are some good and bad sites and dates, but it's more mixed. And when we do the assessment using that STV, the statistical threshold value on a site-by-site basis, that looks a little bit more favorable as well. And overall, it seems likely that we'll be able to predict concentrations based on things like location and cumulative rainfall. We will need a larger, more robust data set to have better predictions. Next, please. And predictions are important because what we want to know is it safe to swim? And in particular, is it safe to swim today? One of the problems with bacterial monitoring is you collect the water sample, it goes off to simmer in the lab for a few days, and you get a result back that says, okay, well, 5 days ago when you collected this, it was a high or low bacteria day. Well, I don't want to know what it was 5 days ago. I want to know today when I've got my bathing suit on and I'm thinking about whether or not to get in the water. So statistical models can help with that. If we can correlate those bacterial concentrations to things that we can measure in real time, then we can determine today that today's a good day or a bad day to go in the water. And we've got a great template for that exact system. So Philadelphia's Rivercast system, as Steve mentioned, is doing exactly that. Under the hood, there's a statistical model, and it feeds out to the user whether it's a red, a yellow, or a green day. The day that I happened to do this screenshot was a red day, but there's lots of green days that are indicated by that system. Some analytical improvements that are on the horizon include things that can look at bacteria on a more real-time basis. So USGS right now is evaluating something called the Fluidian Alert. This is an in situ system that does kind of a quickie incubation, and it'll suck in a sample, and about 6 hours later, it will tell you that you know, this is a high bacteria or a low bacteria day. Next slide, please. So why don't we just turn off the bacteria? Well, there's effort toward that. So all of the facilities that have CSOs, all the municipalities that have CSOs are working on CSO long-term control plans. There's a lot of effort toward MS4 permitting. There's a lot of effort toward stormwater management. And there's even gray infrastructure effort. So Philadelphia Water Department recently received a docket from DRBC to capture and disinfect more combined sewer water that was coming to the Northeast treatment plant. So all of that is good. All of that helps to reduce the bacterial load to the estuary. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it's a long-term proposition. Philadelphia is about a decade into a 25-year effort just on the long-term control plans. And to get more reduction is going to require more money. And by the way, the 2.7 billion that I mentioned several slides ago, that is separate and apart from this. That is totally oriented toward the wastewater treatment plant end. And this is separate from that. So this is all water that's ultimately not going to the wastewater treatment plant. The other thing to keep in mind is that while all these efforts reduce the load of bacteria to the estuary, we can't right now say exactly what the estuary bacterial concentration will be once these efforts have matured and approached build out. Next slide, please. And bacteria is not the only hazard. This estuary is a busy shipping port. We've got hazardous currents. The Delaware is real wide at the bottom and it's real narrow in the urbanized portion. So all of that tidal energy gets squeezed into that narrow portion, and you get very high tidal currents in that zone 3 and upper zone 4. And there's a lot of legacy infrastructure on the bottom. There's also junk on the bottom. The two images on the left-hand side are from Washington Avenue Green in Philadelphia. The top image is at high tide, and if you went there at high tide, you might look at this and say, that looks like a pretty good place to go in and paddle around. But if you looked at it at low tide, you see there's a lot of structure on the bottom, a lot of man-made stuff, a lot of opportunity to get your foot caught. And so if you saw this location at low tide, you might say, oh, that's not a good place to go in. And next slide. So what are the next steps for us? We're continuing to monitor in 2020 and beyond. One of the analytical approaches that we're looking at is to try and figure out how much of the bacteria is human-derived and how much of it is animal-derived. And of course, we're continuing to coordinate with our Water Quality Advisory Committee, and in particular, looking for them to help us to set priorities in our water resources program. And that is it for me.
Okay, hello, my name is Michelle Cross, and Steve asked me to talk about drinkable water. Drinkable does not mean we can drink the water directly from the Delaware, but rather that we can use the water from the river for different purposes with reasonable or no treatment. This applies to groundwater as well, which is inextricably linked to surface water. I'm primarily going to speak about waters from the estuary, but we'll briefly touch upon other issues related to drinkable and usable waters. Next slide, please. There are many types of water users in the basin and the estuary. The two major water utilities are Philadelphia Water Department and the New Jersey American Water Company. They do a great job of treating the wide range of water quality conditions that occur in the estuary. Philadelphia's Baxter treatment plant is the picture on the upper left. There are also manufacturing companies such as the Kimberly-Clark Corporation, which produces paper products, and Evonik, which produces a variety of specialty chemicals. The Kimberly-Clark plant is the picture on the bottom left, and the Evonik Chester plant is on the upper right. There are also several thermoelectric power generators that also use water from the estuary. Exelon owns both the Hope Creek and Salem nuclear generating stations. The picture on the lower right is of the Salem generating station viewed from the water. There are many threats to use of estuary water. Steve mentioned the term contaminants of emerging concern. They include pharmaceuticals, personal care products like soap and surfactants in soap, and other chemicals and substances that make their way into the water and don't break down. As Steve mentioned, polyalkyl substances, or PFAS, they were used to make nonstick products like Teflon and firefighting foams. As technology gets better at detecting different compounds, new chemical threats may also be identified. Though not so much in the estuary, toxic, harmful algal blooms are also a threat. Algae thrive in warm, calm water. With the predicted increases in air temperature and thus water temperature, harmful algal blooms, or also known as HABs, are becoming more frequent, particularly in some of the reservoirs in the basin. Next slide, please. Chemical spills are also a threat to drinkable, usable water. This is a photo of a 2012 train derailment when a bridge collapsed over the Mantua Creek. One of the tanker cars was breached, resulting in a spill of 23,000 gallons of toxic vinyl chloride. The graph on the right is from an analysis of our spill model. We run this overnight for the Delaware River Early Warning System to provide information about the movement of contamination after a spill event. Each of the lines on the graph represent a time and a concentration of a contaminant at different locations after the spill. The location along the river is the bottom axis, with the ocean to the left and Trenton to the right. For this particular spill, the drinking water intakes around River Mile 110 were not impacted by the spill. Next slide, please. In addition to the contaminants of emerging concern, harmful algal blooms, and spills, salt or salinity and sea level rise also pose threats to drinkable water. The map on the left shows the water users, both ground and surface water, in the lower portion of the basin. Instant water users are indicated by yellow circles with a red outline. Other surface water users are indicated as black dots, and groundwater users are indicated by green dots. The picture on the right is of the Delaware River at Trenton during the drought of the 1960s. There may have been plentiful water in the estuary due to its connection with the ocean, but the amount of fresh water coming downstream is what helps regulate how salty the water becomes and if we can treat it. At the Commission's July 1965 drought emergency hearing, representatives from industries and businesses testified about the damage to their facilities as a result of high salinity water. One industry testified that the damage to pipes and equipment at their plant would cost them $1.4 million in today's dollars. Salts in freshwater are also increasing due to the use of salts and fertilizers, which run off into the waterways. For short periods of time, typically in the winter, salt in freshwater can be a greater threat than salt from the ocean. Next slide, please. The map on the right is just another zoomed in version of the water users in the basin. The other thing I want to show you here is the figure on the right, which is a schematic of key locations in the estuary related to salinity. One of the indicators we use for real-time assessment of the water's suitability for use is something called the salt front. The salt front is where salty water from the ocean becomes well mixed with fresh water from the land or the non-tidal river. The location of the salt front is determined using measurements of specific conductants and chlorides at several locations in the estuary and interpolating where the chloride concentration is. Those measurements are collected real-time by the U.S. Geological Survey and are available online. At chloride concentrations of 250 milligrams per liter, water providers receive taste and odor complaints from their customers. The salt front typically hangs out around the Delaware Memorial Bridge, River Mile 69. But in the drought of the 1960s, the salt front was as far upstream as River Mile 102, which is 2 miles north of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge and just 8 miles south of the water treatment plants. During the drought, the average monthly flows at Trenton were as low as 170 million gallons per day, which is 1,500 cubic feet per second. After the drought, DRBC developed a drought management program which coordinates reservoir releases to provide enough water flowing into the estuary to keep the salt downstream. Under this drought management programs, the lowest the flow should be are around 1,600 million gallons per day or 2,500 cubic feet per second. That's 1.5 times the amount the flow was in the 1960s. In recent dry periods, the salt front has reached River Mile 100 just south of the airport. The drought management goal is for the salt front to stay below the confluence with the Schuylkill River at River Mile 92. So you could say our drought management plan is working. Next slide, please. Another threat to drinkable, usable water is sea level rise. This graphic represents the estuary and the mixing of salty and fresh water. Ocean water is coming in from the left and fresh water from the non-tidal river is coming from the right. On the top is the estuary today, and on the bottom is the estuary with sea level rise. The arrows inside the boxes represent the magnitude of the influence of ocean and fresh water have on the location of the salt front. With sea level rise, the force from the ocean pushing salt upstream increases, while the force of fresh water pushing salt downstream remains the same. Thus, as the sea level rises, the salt front is more likely to be farther upstream than we currently experience, especially during dry weather conditions. Next slide, please. DRBC used the three-dimensional hydrodynamic model that John mentioned to investigate how the location of the salt front would be impacted by sea level rise. This graphic shows the area of the river between the Commodore Valley Bridge at River Mile 80 and the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge at River Mile 108. The 5 panels represent the range of the salt front location under dry weather conditions with no sea level rise and 4 estimates of sea level rise, 0.3, 0.5, 1, and 1.6 meters. Where the blue and light pink sections meet is the most upstream location of the salt front during the simulation. The middle panel is River Mile, a sea level rise of 1/2 mile. The salt front will move further upstream than the Schuylkill River. With sea level rise of 1.6 meters, the salt front may be as far upstream as the Betsy Ross Bridge, which is only 5 miles south of the drinking water intakes. We also performed an analysis with additional inflows to the estuary to determine how much water it might take to keep the salt front below the Schuylkill River. The line between the light and medium pink represents the addition of 500 cubic feet per second or 323 million gallons per day. And the line between the medium and dark pink represents the addition of 1,000 cubic feet per second or 643 million gallons per day. We did this for a period of 2 months. For 1/2 meter of sea level rise, an additional 500 CFS can possibly keep the salt front below the Schuylkill River. However, for sea level rise of 1 or 1.6 meters, not even an additional 1,000 CFS will push the salt front below the Schuylkill River. And just for a reference, 1,000 CFS for 61 days or 2 months is 39 billion gallons, which would be like releasing more than all of the water from the Never Sink Reservoir over a 2-month period. Next slide, please. There are potentially options we have to reduce the risk from sea level rise to drinkable, usable water. In our near-term toolbox, we could release more water from existing storage or reservoirs. FE Walter on the bottom left is a potential source of that water. We could also consider relocating intakes to an upstream, but that would be difficult but doable. Another option is desalinization, but that can be twice the cost of traditional treatment and requires a large amount of energy for operation. We could also build a barrier to the upstream movement of salt. The photo on the upper right is of the Harenvliet Dam in the Netherlands. It separates the Rhine and Neuse rivers from the North Sea, creating a freshwater reservoir. As you can imagine, this was detrimental to the ecology of the estuary. Recently, 6 nature organizations in the Netherlands worked to have these gates open most of the time so it could reconnect the rivers to the sea and restore the estuary to a healthier condition. Next slide, please. DRBC is working to further define the risks to drinkable usable water from sea level rise and climate change. We have several studies looking to the availability of fresh water given increases in temperature, changes in precipitation, and altered storm patterns. Other studies are looking at storage, existing and new, and how to best utilize it. DRBC is engaging experts in our advisory committees. We have an advisory committee on climate change and a water management advisory committee to design analyses and avenues of investigation to quantify these risks. Then collectively with our stakeholders, we will identify management measures and implementation strategies to mitigate these risks to drinkable usable water. And with that, I'll hand it back to Steve.
Thanks, Amy. That's a lot, I'll just say that. And we're a little bit behind, and I'll try and catch up, but I do want to talk about a few more subjects, leave you with a little more to think about. I do want to thank Amy and John for their contributions and really for all the work that they do, and not just for these presentations, but behind the scenes to manage and protect and improve the waters. So thanks, Amy. Thanks, John. Again, if the goal is fishable, swimmable waters in the urban estuary, again, in our seat as regulators, we get a lot of people pointing at us and say, well, you know, change the regulation. And certainly there's no question, number one, that is the goal. I mean, I think collectively, the commission, the states, we all support the Clean Water Act. We support the goal of fishable, swimmable waters. You can see that there's challenges, lots of challenges. And in order to address the issue of improving water quality, we can't just focus solely on regulation. We have to focus on all the issues that will help support an integrated solution. So I want to leave you with a few thoughts, to think about on top of the exceptional technical issues that Amy and John talked about. Focus, funding, equity, and priorities, and I'll try and do it as quickly as possible. Can I go next, please? So focus. I think John made the point, and I'll just reinforce it here, that if we want to make measurable improvements in the water quality in the urban estuary, it requires solutions focused on the urban estuary. And we've talked about these two subjects, but I just want to reinforce it. What you're seeing here are maps. They're the same area between Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington. And on the left, you see where the largest ammonia discharges are. And that clearly is in the urban estuary. Likewise, the CSO outfalls on the bacteria issue and trying to address recreational uses and swimmable waters. There might be one CSO in Trenton, but otherwise the combined sewer overflows are in Camden, in Philadelphia, in Delaware County, in Wilmington, and in those areas. So the sources of pollution are right in the estuary, and that's where we need to focus on solving some of these issues. Next, please. There's always going to be the issue of who pays. And again, I've been told, well, just make the dischargers pay. Well, that's an interesting proposition because the dischargers, in many cases, again, the dischargers kind of come back to us. It's that us equation again. Sure, there's, excuse me, some industrial dischargers, but as we said, in order to address many of these issues, these are municipal wastewater treatment plants, meaning that the dischargers are those who collect their funds from local taxpayers and local ratepayers, and that's who would be burdened the most if the dischargers would have to pay. Now, clearly they would have to pay something, but there might be other sources of funding and a lot of question marks there. And again, don't have solutions. But again, on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the federal government. Clearly, the example of the federal government coming in and providing the wastewater treatment that John Yag talked about to address secondary treatment was critical in meeting the goal of improving dissolved oxygen to where we get it today. There's the issue of potentially who benefits the most. We are very fortunate in this basin to have philanthropic organizations like William Penn support the Watershed. I'm not suggesting that they pay either. I'm just saying that, you know, as part of the equation, clearly we need to work together to make sure that ultimately we can support, again, not just fishable waters. Again, there's certainly areas we can improve and maybe get fishable and swimmable waters in certain areas. But if we want to get to the point where the entire urban estuary is fishable and swimmable, it's going to take the billions that John talked about and more. Next slide, please. So just quickly on federal funding, those, and many of you are part of the coalition and on this call have worked tirelessly to get more federal funding into the Delaware Basin. For that, you should be celebrated, you should be applauded, you should be thanked, and thank you from our perspective as well. I will say a lot of the new federal funding is not necessarily aimed at the urban estuary, and for all the right reasons. Clearly, there are issues within the watershed that are not just issues of urban fishable, swimmable waters. So if we want to attack the issue of urban fishable, swimmable waters in a meaningful way, we do need to think about that equation. Those who work on influencing federal funding, those who work on trying to get more funding into the water sector and more funding into the Delaware River, more funding for recreational urban use, those that have been so successful in doing that for the basin in general, hopefully we'll be thinking about that in terms of the focus that we need to solve the problems in the estuary and the investment that's needed. I will say this, that we're in a competition in the Delaware Basin. We're in a competition for federal dollars in general. And I think we all know that. So that when it comes to trying to influence more funds into the basin, we're competing with other parts of the country, other river basins. You've heard a lot of talk about the Chesapeake and the Great Lakes. We want to make sure that we get our share, and those who can help us to get our share would really help to advance this and accelerate this issue further. There's a lot of discussion right now. We're in tough times, tough economic times, and a lot of discussion about infrastructure as an economic stimulus. And again, we want to make sure that clean water is a piece of that infrastructure, because we're competing with other sectors as well for that infrastructure stimulus. Generally, infrastructure is a bipartisan issue, and we like that. We like the fact that both sides of the aisle like water infrastructure and infrastructure in general. We see that through consistent approval of the Water Resource Development Act and the American Water Infrastructure Act. And again, if we can leverage that bipartisanship to bring more funds into the Delaware River, all the better. And yes, we do need to fund the DRBC as well. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it shows that in general, public infrastructure as a percentage of GDP has been going down, except during after the Great Recession. Infrastructure was used as an economic stimulus during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. But you can see on the right there that water and wastewater is really just a small piece of it. And it's back to the same issue. We have to compete with roadways and electricity and airports to get our share. And hopefully when we get our share, we also want to focus some of that share on the issues of urban estuary, fishable, swimmable, and drinkable waters. Next slide. Certainly, we need to make sure that everyone has access to fishable, swimmable, and drinkable waters. I did get a chance to see the Urban Promise video of their boat tour of the Cooper River, and I think that's the kind of access that we're talking about from an equitable standpoint. This screenshot of EPA's environmental justice tool shows low-income population centers in Philadelphia and in Camden. And we want to make sure that everyone has access to fishable, swimmable, and drinkable waters. I think that's the equity goal. But there's another piece to the equity equation. Next slide, please. And that is who pays and who pays for what. Again, if we want to talk about the billions of dollars of investment that's needed to ultimately get to fishable, swimmable waters in the estuary, we want to make sure that those stakeholders who have a stake in paying for this have a seat at the table. These are some pictures that I got along the way of examples of people using the urban estuary at this point for potential recreation. But if it's about playing paddle ball and paddle boards, again, I don't know that that's the full objective. And certainly we want to make sure that everyone's got a seat at the table, making decisions about funding and the equity issues to make sure everyone has access to these waters. Next, please. And a couple of days ago or last week, Howard Newkrug from the Water Center at University of Pennsylvania gave an excellent presentation about this same subject, and I was jealous because he had so many good pictures in that thing. But he did an excellent job of talking about the practical issues of fishable and swimmable waters in the Delaware. And the reason he was doing that is he's leading a project that's being funded by the William Penn Foundation called the Roadmap Project, that's specifically looking about swimming in the Delaware. And what he said at that presentation, I stole from him. It says, we'll reach our economic endpoint long before we reach our environmental endpoint. And what he means is, it's probably not enough money to do everything we need to do. Clearly, I've talked about in the past our priorities at DRBC to address the drinking, swimmable, and fishable waters that Amy and John talked about. If you broaden that umbrella a little bit wider and you talk about our community, society, and you look at water only and the series of issues that need to be addressed in these communities, from climate change to affordability to lead service lines, I'm not even sure from a priority standpoint that water would raise up. There's probably other community issues that people would be concerned about in these communities. And those communities need to have a say in these priorities as well. Next slide. I stole a slide or some of this stuff from the U.S. Water Alliance from their One Water Policy Framework. I'll just touch on the top one, which says that, look, if we're gonna be not have enough money for everything, we ought to at least make sure that our investments provide economic, environmental, and societal returns and get multiple benefits from it all. Next slide. So the Delaware River is a national success story, no question about it. And the reason it's a national success story is that we've made so many water quality improvements and we've made so much remarkable progress on improving our urban estuary water quality. We know that getting to the next step of fishable, swimmable, and protecting on the threats of drinkable water will be an extreme challenge that will require complex and integrated solutions. I can just tell you that I'm committed to working with our staff, with the states, and with the Basin community to take on the challenge. It'll be challenging, to say the least, but you certainly have our commitment to continue to work on it. And I think we're going to open it up to questions. Well, Kelly, do you have the poll question? We're a little bit over time, but do you have the poll question? So I'm going to take off my glasses, and 75% of the people said to stay out of the water. A couple of people said to wade up to your knees, but nobody said go forward, enjoy your swim, and that's good news. I would not recommend a loved one to go for a swim after a rainfall. You're a very educated audience, and the results are clear. So that is part of the issue there. With education, with understanding of what the risks are, clearly you would make a decision that you wouldn't necessarily go in that water. So we have work to do. It's good work. We have a very fortunate problem here that the water quality's gotten to the point where people want to swim in, and that's a good thing. And like I said, we're going to hopefully work together with the Basin community to achieve those goals. Let's open it up to questions. Kelly, do you see any questions?
Yes, there's two in the chat box currently. Let me pull them up for you. Tim asked, are the estimated costs just hard costs to do the upgraded treatment, or does the analysis take a broader look at the social, economic, or community benefits, which might be viewed as offsetting these costs?
So I think I can grab that one. Under Resolution 2017-4, we're required to look at the socioeconomic factors that are affecting attainability. And the Kleinfelder report was just the cost portion. So that's not all the obligation under 2017-4, but that's kind of the first step of that. We have been working cooperatively with University of Delaware. They were a co-applicant on the same grant that funded the Kleinfelder report. And I know that under that grant, they're going to be looking at some of the other factors associated with that socioeconomic evaluation. We may have more to do beyond what comes out of the UDEL report. So we really have to kind of wait for that analysis to be completed. But the short answer is yes, we have to look at those socioeconomic factors, but there's still quite a bit more to be done on that.
The answer was yes, but the answer really was, it only included hard cost, right? It did not include the benefit cost as well. So. Any other questions, Kelly?
That's the only one in the chat box, but if other folks have questions, feel free to type, or you can take yourself off mute if you feel comfortable as well.
And I added to the chat box that fuller report on the bacterial water quality, if anybody wants to look at that.
So Suzanne would like to ask a question.
Yes, I have a question. With the data that's being compiled concerning the effects of climate change on the water in our estuary and our river in the Delaware, will this information be disseminated to the general public so that they can understand what's involved with the salt changes, so that they can reflect on that and consider that as they vote for different folks in elections?
Yes, we have an advisory committee on climate change, and we have some information posted there already. The advisory committee on climate change is open to the public, and we'll be releasing information probably through that. You can also just check our website on the climate change page, and we'll also be posting information there.
Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, I want to leave folks with this slide. We are looking for feedback. I put the survey in the chat box. We'd love to get your response on this session, the information that was presented, and how we can improve for future forums and meetings, et cetera, as well. There is a session coming up at 2:30. I believe it's the last round of breakouts for the forum. So please take advantage of all our wonderful speakers. And again, thank you all for your time today.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you, everyone.
Anyone else want to say anything, last words to wrap it up?
I just want to say thank everybody for coming. Thanks to the sponsors, and especially thanks to you, Kelly, for helping us get through this. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, Suzanne, I put a link to the advisory committee on climate change in the chat.
Thanks, Amy.
Take care.